He had been on scholarship since the first day of his freshman year. It was a merit scholarship, which was the specific kind of scholarship that required a GPA of 3.5 or above to maintain, and which covered tuition and fees and a housing stipend, and which had been in the Hayes family's financial planning. The difference between Darnell Watkins attending Harmon County State University and Darnell Watkins not attending any university at all. His parents had driven from Millfield to the university for orientation in August of his freshman year, which was a 4-hour drive each way, and they had driven it in the specific way that parents drive their child to the first day of a future they have been building toward for 18 years. Not the drive of people who make this drive regularly, but the drive of people for whom this particular destination is freighted with the specific weight of everything it represents, which in Sylvia and Curtis Watkins's case was the specific weight of a generation's worth of choices made and work done in the specific direction of this outcome. His mother worked as a home health aide. She had worked for the same agency for 14 years, the specific daily labor of being present in other people's homes to provide the care those people required, which was demanding work, in the specific way that work is demanding, when the physical and emotional requirements of the job are both high, and when the compensation does not reflect those requirements. His father worked in plant maintenance at the Millfield industrial facility. He had worked there for 22 years. He had worked the morning shift, which meant he was up at 4:30 and at the plant by 5:30 and home by 3:30 in the afternoons, which had left the 3:30 to 8 window as the family time, the specific interval in which the Watkins household had assembled itself around dinner and homework, and the conversation that a family has when it is together in the specific daily way that makes a family a family. They had driven Darnell to orientation. They had driven back to Millfield the same evening, which was an 8-hour round trip for the two of them, and they had done it without any particular commentary about the driving or the length of the trip, because the trip was not the point, and they had not been thinking about the trip. They had been thinking about Darnell. He was the first in his family to attend university, not the first to aspire to it. His mother had taken community college courses in her 20s before the agency work and before the marriage, and before the specific accumulating shape of an adult life had reorganized her time. She had taken 2 courses, English composition and basic accounting, and had done well in both of them, and she had, when Darnell was old enough to understand what the transcripts meant, shown them to him not as a relic of something lost, but as a record of what she had been capable of, and what she would have pursued if the circumstances had arranged themselves differently. She had shown him the grades. She had shown him what A- looked like in a college grade book, and she had said, "I know what this is. I always knew." His father had wanted to study engineering and had not had the financial resources to pursue it after high school, and had gone directly to work and had been going directly to work for 22 years. He had maintained the engineering interest as a side practice rather than a career. The specific methodical attention to how things worked that had made him an effective maintenance worker was the same quality of mind that would have made him an engineer, and he applied it in the plant and at home and in the occasional project. The deck extension he built behind the Millfield house in 2009, the electrical rewiring he did on the garage in 2014, that gave the aptitude somewhere to go. He had bought Darnell his first programming book when Darnell was 12. He had not been sure what programming was exactly, but he had understood that it was the construction of systems using logic, which was a thing he understood, and he had found the book on a clearance table at the Millfield Bookstore and brought it home and put it on Darnell's desk and said, "I think you might like this." Darnell had liked it. They had wanted this for Darnell in the way that parents who have navigated a specific lack want something for their children, not as a corrective or a compensation, but as a thing that was genuinely possible for him, that had not been genuinely possible for them, and for which they had created the conditions through the 14 years of home health aide work and the 22 years of plant maintenance and the specific consistent attention to Darnell's education that had produced a student who qualified for a merit scholarship at the state university. The scholarship letter had come in April of his senior year of high school. Sylvia Watkins had opened it at the kitchen table. She had read it twice. She had called Curtis at the plant. He had come home 2 hours early. They had sat at the kitchen table together with the letter between them, and Curtis had read it, and he had not said anything for a moment. Then he had said full tuition. Sylvia had said and the housing stipend. Curtis had said he's going. She had said he's going. It was not a celebration in the demonstrative sense. They were not demonstrative people in that way. It was the specific, quiet acknowledgement of a thing that had happened, of a letter on a kitchen table in Millfield, being the physical form of something they had been moving toward for 18 years, and of the fact that the moving had produced the thing it was moving toward. He had been here for 14 months. He had a 3.7 GPA. He had not missed a payment deadline, which was the administrative marker of the scholarship's maintenance requirements, not because the deadlines were difficult, but because the deadlines were what the scholarship required, and the scholarship was what the education required, and the education was the point. He had developed in his 14 months at Harmon County State the specific habits of a student who understands that the scholarship is a structure that requires maintenance, and who builds his daily life around maintaining it, the specific allocation of time between coursework and the library and the study group, and the specific strategic assessment of how to apportion the limited hours of a day between the competing demands of a full course load. He studied from 8 to noon most days, took lunch, and returned to the library by 1:30. He did not skip lectures. He did not miss problem set submissions because problem set submissions were the incremental accumulation from which semester grades were built, and because he had learned in his first semester that the students who treated problem sets as optional were the students for whom the midterm was a crisis. He was not one of those students. He had learned his study habits partly from his own experience of what worked and partly from the specific model his parents had set for him. Not in studying, neither of his parents had attended university, but in the larger practice of showing up consistently and doing what the situation required without treating it as negotiable. His mother had never called in sick to the agency unless she was actually too ill to provide care. His father had 22 years of uninterrupted plant attendance, a record the maintenance supervisor had mentioned at the last company recognition event. They had modeled consistency not as a moral lecture, but as a lived practice. And Darnell had absorbed it in the way children absorb what they are shown, rather than what they are told. He was studying computer science. He had chosen computer science in the specific way that a student chooses a field when the choice is grounded in both genuine aptitude and practical reasoning. The aptitude came first in the form of the specific absorbed engagement with the logic of programming that he had discovered in his junior year of high school, in a computer applications course that the teacher had taught well enough to make visible what programming actually was, as opposed to the informal software use that everyone had always called computers. The practical reasoning came after in the form of the recognition that the field the aptitude pointed toward was also a field with employment outcomes that were measurable and favorable. He was good at it. He had a facility for the specific layered problem solving that programming required the ability to hold multiple levels of a problem in mind simultaneously, and to move between them without losing track of either the detail or the architecture which his computer science professor, a woman named Dr. Anita Reeves, who had been teaching at the university for 17 years, had noted in his first semester in the specific direct way that good professors note aptitude by assigning harder problems. He had stayed after class to work on them. He had gotten them right. He was in his sophomore year now, which was the year that the course sequence began to differentiate the students who were going to be able to do what the field actually required from the students who had found the introductory courses accessible, and who discovered in the sophomore year that the introductory courses had been the accessible part. Darnell was in the group that the sophomore year was sorting toward what the field actually required. He knew this. He did not treat it as a finished thing because he had been in school long enough to know that knowing you are on the right track is not the same as staying on the right track, and that staying on the right track required the specific daily work of showing up and doing what the coursework demanded. He had been doing that work for 14 months. He was doing it on the afternoon of the incident. He had a midterm in 3 days in the algorithms course that was the technically most demanding course in his current schedule. and he had spent the morning in the library working through the practice problems the professor had posted, and he had gone to the bookstore at 1:47 in the afternoon to buy the supplemental workbook that the professor had put on the course resource list, which cost $32, and which he had decided he needed after the morning's work had shown him that he needed more practice problems than the professor's posted set contained. The morning in the library had been productive. He had arrived at 8:50, had gotten his usual table on the second floor near the window that overlooked the East Quad, and had worked through the first 8 problems in the professor's posted set by 11:45. The problems covered sorting algorithm complexity, which was the foundational material, and the dynamic programming problems that the algorithms course was using to build toward the midterm's harder sections. He had found the first 6 problems workable with the material he had covered in lecture. The 7th and 8th had pushed him to his notes and then to the textbook, and then to a point where he had looked at the problem for 11 minutes without progress before identifying the approach. He had written the approach out step by step. He had worked through the solution. He had gotten it. That was the moment when he had decided to go to the bookstore, because the 9th problem in the posted set was pointing toward a formulation he did not have a clean model for, and he knew from the morning's work that the supplemental workbook contained worked examples that would give him the model. He had checked the time. 1:47. The midterm was Tuesday. He had the afternoon. He had gone to the bookstore. He had gone in through the front entrance, which was a glass door off the East Academic Building lobby, and had navigated the bookstore in the direct, efficient way of a student who knows what he is there for, and where it is likely to be past the spiritware displays and the stationery section and the general textbook shelves to the computer science and mathematics section at the back, where the course resource materials were shelved by department. He had found the workbook. He had taken it to Register 3. M. Torres had scanned it and taken his debit card and run the transaction and given him the receipt, which had printed at 1:53 p.m. in the thermal paper that said exactly what had happened. He had put the receipt in his jacket pocket. He had walked out of the bookstore at 1:58 p.m. He had paid for the workbook. He had his receipt. He was on his way back to the library when Officer Keith Pruitt stopped him on the East Quad at 2:31. Pruitt had been on the campus security detail for 3 years, contracted through the county security service that held the university's campus security contract. He had been assigned to the East Quad Patrol for 7 months, which meant he covered the academic buildings on the east side of the campus, including the university bookstore, which was housed in the East Academic Building, and which he had walked past many times in 7 months, without developing the specific institutional knowledge of the bookstore's regular customers that a longer-tenured officer might have developed. The East Quad was a busy place during the academic day, which was a fact that a 7-month officer was still in the process of learning to read the specific patterns of student movement that distinguished ordinary campus life from something that warranted attention. The rhythms of the academic schedule. The difference between a student walking quickly because they are late to class and a student moving in a way that suggested something other than an ordinary campus transit. Pruitt had not yet fully developed the reading of the East Quad that 7 months of walking it was beginning to produce. What he had in place of that fully developed reading was a quicker response to things that seemed to him out of place, which was not uncommon in officers who were still in the process of developing the institutional knowledge that makes the distinction between out of place and unfamiliar possible. The distinction between those two things, out of place and unfamiliar, was a distinction that experience built, and that the absence of experience collapsed, so that unfamiliar began to feel like out of place, when the officer did not have enough accumulated context to tell them apart. He had received a call at 2:27. The call was from the bookstore's inventory desk, reporting that a textbook had been removed from the display shelf without a transaction appearing in the point-of-sale system, which was the bookstore's way of logging a possible theft. The person who made the call had not seen anyone take the book. The call contained no description of a suspect. The call contained no articulable account of an observed removal, only the absence of a transaction in the system for a book that had been on the shelf an hour earlier. Pruitt had received the call and had gone to the East Quad, which was the outdoor area between the bookstore entrance and the library building. He had looked at the quad. He had seen Darnell Watkins walking from the direction of the bookstore toward the library. He had made a decision. He approached. He said, "Excuse me, stop right there." Darnell stopped. He said, "What's going on?" Pruitt said, "I need to ask you some questions about something that was reported from the bookstore." Darnell looked at him. He had spent 20 years in the world as a black man in America, which meant that he had developed as black men in America, developed the specific calibrated awareness of what certain interactions required of him if they were going to end without escalation. He had been pulled over twice in Millfield with his father on drives where his father was doing nothing wrong and where the stop produced the specific uncomfortable ritual of a black man being correct and careful and compliant in the specific way that the moment required, and afterward driving away without discussing it because the discussion would not have changed the fact that it happened, and his father had known in those moments that Darnell was watching how he handled it. He was handling it now. He said, "Okay, what's the issue?" Pruitt said, "There's been a report of a theft from the bookstore. I need to check your bag." Darnell said, "I just bought something from the bookstore. I have a receipt." He produced his receipt from his jacket pocket. It showed the transaction, 1 supplemental algorithms workbook, $32 paid at 1:53 p.m. register 3 cashier M. Torres. Pruitt looked at it. He said, "I still need you to come with me to the security office." Darnell said, "I paid for everything I have." The receipt shows the transaction. I was at the cashier's register at 1:53. Whatever was reported as missing happened after I left. Pruitt said, "Come with me to the security office." He said it with the flat, decided quality of an officer who has committed to a course of action and is not going to be moved from it by the logical presentation of exculpatory information. Darnell looked at him. He was 20 years old on scholarship with a midterm in 3 days and a library table he had been working at since 9 in the morning and a receipt in his hand that said exactly what had happened. He made a decision. The decision was the same decision his father had made on the side of the road in Millfield when the officer had come to the car window, which was the same decision his father's father had made in the same situations in the generation before, which was the decision that had been transmitted to Darnell, not as a rule, but as an observed fact about what the moment required, that there were specific times when the most intelligent and most strategic response to a situation was the response that allowed the situation to run its course without escalation. Because the alternative response is argument refusal. The insistence on the logic that should have been obvious did not change the outcome available in the moment, and could produce outcomes that were worse. He understood this. He did not like it. He went with him. The security office was in the administration building, which was a 5-minute walk across the East Quad. Darnell walked across the East Quad with Pruitt beside him, which was a walk that went past the main cluster of benches where students gathered between classes and past the dining hall entrance, and past the window of the computer science building where his algorithms professor's office was, which was a walk he had made many times and which he was now making in a different configuration than he had ever made it before. He sat in the security office for 28 minutes. The office was a small room off the main corridor of the administration building, institutional, in the specific way of rooms that have been fitted for a functional purpose without any investment in the experience of occupying them. A metal desk, 2 chairs, a whiteboard with response protocols on it, a window that looked into the corridor rather than outside. The fluorescent light was the kind that made the room feel smaller than it was. He put his bag on the floor beside the chair. He put the receipt on the desk where it remained for the full 28 minutes visible to both of them, containing in its 2-inch thermal paper strip the complete answer to the question that Pruitt had not yet thought to consult it for the time, the register, the cashier's identifier, the item, the amount, the method of payment. He sat correctly. He sat with his hands in his lap and his back not quite touching the back of the chair, and the specific held quality of a person who is managing the available expression of what is happening inside them, because the available expression was not going to help him and might make things worse, and he had enough information about how these situations worked to know that the expression available to him needed to be the one that was going to leave the least room for a different narrative to form around what was happening. He thought about the algorithm's midterm. He thought about it not as an escape, but as the specific anchoring fact of what the next 3 days required of him, and what the next 3 days were going to produce regardless of what was happening in this room. The midterm was Tuesday. The algorithms were the algorithms. The practice problems in the workbook he had just bought were waiting in his bag. And when this room was over, and it was going to be over because the receipt was on the desk and the receipt said what happened, he was going to go back to the library and open the workbook and work through the next set of problems. He thought about his mother. He thought about her in the specific way you think about a parent in a moment that you do not want them to know you are in. Not because you are trying to hide something from them, but because the knowledge would cause them a distress that the moment does not deserve to cause. His mother had worked 14 years as a home health aide, and she had navigated the specific daily difficulty of that work with the specific patient endurance that difficult work requires. And she did not deserve to receive a call from an institutional setting telling her that her son was in a security office at his university because a 6-week employee had not recognized him. He was not going to call her from this office. He sent the text to Marcus. He sat in the chair. He waited. Pruitt reviewed the bookstore call. He did not in those 28 minutes access the bookstore's point-of-sale records to confirm the transaction on Darnell's receipt. He did not access the campus security camera footage from the bookstore entrance, which would have shown Darnell exiting the building at 1:58 9 minutes before the inventory desk made the call to security. He did not contact the bookstore manager, whose name was Tanya Mills, and who had been managing the university bookstore for 11 years, and who, when she was later called, confirmed immediately that the receipt Darnell had was a legitimate transaction from Register 3, and that M. Torres, the cashier, had been on duty at 1:53 and had processed the sale. He held Darnell in the security office for 28 minutes. The call to Darnell's roommate Marcus had come during the first 10 minutes. Darnell had sent a text from the security office in admin building. They're saying, "Bookstore theft. I have the receipt. Can you call Dr. Osei's office?" Marcus had called Dr. Patricia Osei's office at 2:41. Dr. Osei was the dean of students, a woman who had held the position for 8 years, who had built her career in student affairs on the specific foundational principle that students who encountered institutional obstacles while trying to do what students were supposed to do, attend class, study, meet their academic obligations, deserved an advocate who would move quickly and who understood what was at stake in those moments. She had been in a budget meeting when Marcus called. She had taken the call in the corridor outside the conference room. She had listened to Marcus for 45 seconds. She had said which office. Marcus had said the one off the main corridor in admin. She had said, "I'm on my way." Dr. Patricia Osei had been dean of students at Harmon County State University for 8 years. She had come to the position from a background in student affairs that had taught her several things that she had not known before she had spent years in it, that the moments that determined a student's trajectory were often not the dramatic ones but the small ones. The moments where an institutional obstacle was placed in front of a student who was trying to do what students were supposed to do, and that the institution's response in those moments was the measure of what the institution actually was as opposed to what it described itself as in its promotional materials. She had built her work around those moments. She had learned to move quickly when they occurred because the damage that could be done to a student's sense of their own belonging in an institution was not a slow accumulating thing. It happened in specific incidents in real time, and the response needed to be in real time too. She had walked to the administration building. She had walked at the specific purposeful pace of a woman who has somewhere to be, and who has been doing this long enough to know that pace is a statement that arriving at a speed that communicates urgency is itself a form of advocacy for the student she is walking toward. She arrived at the security office at 2:52. She knocked on the door and opened it, and saw Darnell Watkins sitting in a chair with his receipt on the desk and his bag beside the chair, and the specific contained expression of a 20-year-old who has been in a small institutional room for 28 minutes, being treated as a suspect on the basis of nothing that had held up to examination. She said Darnell. He said Dr. Osei. She said Officer Pruitt. Pruitt said Dr. Osei. I'm in the middle of an identity verification following a theft report from the bookstore. She said, "Can I see the theft report?" He produced it. She read it. She said, "This report contains no description of a suspect. It contains no account of an observed removal. It contains a notation that a book was not in its place and that the point-of-sale system did not show a transaction." Is that an accurate summary? Pruitt said yes. She said, "Can you tell me what specific articulable basis led you to stop this student?" Pruitt said he was walking from the direction of the bookstore. She looked at him. She said he was walking from the direction of the bookstore. She said it back to him not as a question, but as a statement that she was holding up to the light, the way you hold a thin piece of paper, up to the light, to see what it does and does not contain. She said, "The bookstore is a building that students walk from during the academic day." Can you tell me specifically what articulable behavior distinguished this student's transit from the bookstore from the transit of any other student walking from the bookstore in the same period? Pruitt said there was a theft report. She said the theft report contained no description of a suspect. You have established this. Is there any other basis? He did not answer. She said many students walk from the direction of the bookstore. This student has a receipt showing a transaction at 1:53 p.m. The theft was reported at 2:27. Can you show me anything that places him inside the bookstore after 1:53? He could not. She said, "Can you access the bookstore camera footage from 2:27 p.m.? The footage, when it was reviewed on the security office terminal, showed the bookstore entrance for the full window of interest. It showed Darnell Watkins exiting through the front door at 1:58 p.m. with a bookstore bag. It showed 22 other students entering and exiting the bookstore in the period between his exit and the theft report. It showed no re-entry by Darnell Watkins at any point after 1:58 p.m. Dr. Osei looked at the footage. She looked at the timestamp. She looked at the receipt on the desk. She looked at Pruitt. She said, "Darnell, you're free to go." He picked up his bag. He picked up his receipt. He stood. He thanked Dr. Osei. He walked out of the security office. He walked across the east quad, which was now catching the late afternoon light at a different angle than it had been at 1:53. And he went back to the library and he sat at his table, and he opened his algorithms workbook, and he worked on the practice problems because the midterm was in 3 days, and the work was what he was here to do. He worked for 2 hours. He had a harder time concentrating than he usually did. He expected that. He had learned in the incident's immediate aftermath not to expect himself to concentrate at the usual level while the weight of what had just happened was still assembling itself in his mind. He was a methodical person in the way that people who find methodical thinking congenial become methodical in the areas of life beyond study, and he knew that the appropriate response to a disruption of this kind was not to push against the disruption immediately, but to let it be what it was, to do what he could do in the library that afternoon, and to let the rest settle. He opened the algorithms workbook to the section on graph traversal, which was the section he had been working through in the morning, and he read the first problem and understood the first problem and began working through the first problem, and then found that the working through was slower than it usually was, because there was another layer of processing happening in the part of his mind that was not working on the graph traversal problem, which was the part that was replaying the 28 minutes in the security office and the East Quad walk, and the receipt on the desk, and the specific quality of sitting correctly in a chair in a room you should not be in, while a person who has the power to keep you there decides how long they want to exercise that power. He kept working. He had been in harder situations than this one, in the specific sense that harder is a gradient, and this situation was not the hardest. He had been in his father's car on the side of the road in Millfield when the officer had come to the window and his father had done the thing his father did in those moments. He had been in the high school hallway in his junior year when the vice principal had pulled him out of class for a reason that had later turned out to be a mistake in the discipline log, and which had taken 3 days and a call from his mother to resolve. He had navigated those situations in the specific way that he had learned to navigate them by keeping the available expression of what was happening inside him at the level that the situation required, and by doing the next necessary thing. The next necessary thing was the graph traversal problem. He worked through it. He got through 6 practice problems. He packed up at 6:15 and walked back to his residence hall. He called his mother. He had not called from the security office because he had not wanted his mother to receive a call from an institutional setting while he was in that setting, which would have produced a specific maternal alarm that the setting did not deserve to produce and which he had not been able to manage from the chair in the security office. He called from his room where he could tell her the thing that needed to be told in the specific measured way that he was capable of in a place that was his. He told her what had happened. He told her from the beginning with the specific organized account of a person who recounts events in the sequence they occurred, because that sequence is the only way to tell the story correctly. The library that morning, the practice problems, the decision to go to the bookstore, the purchase, the receipt, the East Quad, the stop, the security office, the 28 minutes, Dr. Osei's arrival, what Dr. Osei had said, what Pruitt had said, and what had happened after. He told it in 6 minutes. Sylvia Watkins listened. She did not interrupt. She had learned across 20 years of mothering Darnell that the specific quality of listening she needed to offer him when he was recounting something difficult was the listening that did not redirect or reassure before the account was complete, because redirection and reassurance before the account was complete were forms of not listening, and what he needed first was to be heard. She listened. When he was done, she was quiet for a moment. She said, "Are you okay?" He said, "I'm okay." She said, "You have the receipt?" He said, "I have the receipt." She said, "Dr. Osei came." He said, "Yes." She said, "You're going to file a formal complaint." It was not a question. He said, "Yes." She said, "Good. You call me when you do." He said, "I will." She said, "I love you." He said, "I love you too." He sat in his room after the call. He sat at his desk where the computer science textbooks were stacked, and the course notes were in the specific organized arrangement of a student who has developed a system for keeping track of what needs to be done and when. And he looked at the stack and thought about the algorithms midterm, and the practice problems, and the specific particular work that the next 3 days required. He thought about his father. His father had driven from Millfield for orientation in August of last year. He had stood in the East Quad in the August heat in his best slacks and his blue-collared shirt, the one he wore for the occasions that required it. And he had looked at the campus buildings with the specific, contained expression of a man who does not make his feelings visible because making your feelings visible requires a security that certain circumstances train out of you. He had said to Darnell, standing on the East Quad on orientation day, "This is yours now. You work for this." He had said it with the specific low intensity of a statement that is not motivational in the performative sense, but is simply true in the way that the speaker means it to be true, a fact about what the place was and what Darnell's presence in it meant and what the work was. Curtis Watkins was not a man who said things he did not mean. He had 22 years of early mornings at the plant and a record of showing up that a supervisor had noted at a recognition event. And he understood work in the specific, unromanticized way of a person who has done a lot of it, as the thing that produces results when you do it and does not produce results when you do not. And as the thing that is its own argument, that requires no supplement of sentiment or performance, that speaks entirely through what it produces. He had said, "This is yours." He had meant it without qualification. Darnell had worked for it. He had a 3.7 GPA. He had a receipt. He sat in his room and looked at the course notes. He looked at the stack of textbooks and the organized notes and the desk where he had done the work of the last 14 months, and he sat with the specific quality of a person who has been through something and who is making the transition back to the ordinary table, the ordinary books, the ordinary algorithms problem set due on Thursday, the ordinary forward motion of a student in a university who has not been deterred. He had not been deterred. He was going to think about that carefully later after the midterm in the process of writing the statement. He was going to think about what it meant that the mechanism available to him, the receipt, the camera footage, the bookstore manager's confirmation, the dean of students who moved at the pace of someone who understood what was at stake, had worked, and about what it meant that the mechanism being available and working was not a thing that was guaranteed, that there were students for whom the mechanism would not have worked as quickly or as completely, that the specific combination of a receipt with a visible timestamp, and a dean who stepped out of a budget meeting, and a camera whose footage had been preserved, was a combination that had resolved this situation, and that not every situation came with that combination. He was going to think about that after the midterm. The formal complaint was filed the following morning. Dr. Osei's office assisted him with the filing process, which involved submitting the complaint to the campus security contractor's oversight office and to the university's student affairs division simultaneously, because Dr. Osei had 8 years of institutional knowledge about where complaints in this category needed to go and how to ensure that they went there correctly. The complaint included Darnell's account of the incident with timestamps derived from the receipt and his own notes. The receipt itself, which showed the transaction at 1:53 p.m. The camera footage which Dr. Osei had requested be preserved the previous afternoon before leaving the security office. Tanya Mill's confirmation obtained by Dr. Osei's office that evening that the receipt was legitimate, and the transaction was recorded in the point-of-sale system. The original theft report, which contained no description of a suspect and no account of an observed removal. The investigation was assigned to the contractor's compliance officer, a man named Dennis Farrell, who had 15 years of experience in security contractor oversight and who had, in those 15 years, reviewed many complaints and had developed the specific methodical attention to what the documentation said versus what the incident report said, which was the core professional competence of his role. He reviewed the complaint and the attachments. He reviewed the complaint carefully because the complaint had been assembled with care. It was specific. It was time-stamped. It was supported by documentation that had been preserved before anyone had an opportunity to misplace it. And it told a story that was legible in the way that a story built on primary documentation is legible without interpretation or inference, just the sequence of what had happened and the record that confirmed it. He reviewed the camera footage. He reviewed it 3 times, once for the full period from Darnell's bookstore entry to his exit, once for the window between the exit and Pruitt's stop, and once for the sidewalk stop itself. Each review produced the same sequence. The sequence was not ambiguous. The footage showed a student making a purchase, leaving the building, and being stopped on the quad. It showed the timing. It showed the interval between the exit and the stop call. It showed what was available to Pruitt in the first 30 seconds of the stop if Pruitt had accessed the camera system. He reviewed the original theft report. The report contained no description of a suspect. It contained no account of an observed removal. It contained a notation from an inventory staff member that a specific textbook title was not found in its location on the display shelf, and that the point-of-sale system had no record of a transaction for that title in the prior 3 hours. It was a report of an absence, not an observation. It was the category of report that the contractor's own protocols categorized as requiring assessment before response escalation. He reviewed Pruitt's incident report, which described a suspicious person stop based on proximity to the bookstore following a theft report and a 28-minute identity verification process. He noted that the incident report did not address why the receipt Darnell had produced had not been sufficient to resolve the stop in the first 2 minutes. He noted that the report did not address why the camera footage had not been accessed immediately when access would have shown Darnell's exit from the bookstore at 1:58 p.m. and resolved the matter before any extended detention. He noted that the report did not address why the bookstore manager, who was accessible by radio and who had the point-of-sale records, had not been contacted. He noted that the report did not address the articulable basis for the initial stop, which under the contractor's own protocols required a specific observable behavior beyond proximity to a building from which a theft had been reported. He also reviewed the campus security camera footage from the East Quad entrance for the 30 minutes before Pruitt made his stop. The footage showed 23 students walking from the direction of the bookstore entrance during that window. Pruitt had stopped one of them. He completed his report in 10 days. The findings: unreasonable stop based on no articulable basis for suspicion. Sustained. Failure to take reasonable steps to resolve the stop before extending the detention, including reviewing available documentation, camera footage, and point-of-sale records. Sustained. Pruitt received a formal letter of reprimand placed in his personnel file and a 30-day suspension without pay. He was reassigned to the Administration Building Interior Detail pending completion of training on reasonable suspicion standards and documentation first response protocols. Darnell was notified of the findings by Dr. Osei's office in a letter that arrived 10 days after he had filed his own statement, which was 13 days after the incident. He read the letter at his desk. He read it in the specific, careful way he read documents that contained information he had been waiting for, not scanning for the conclusion, but reading from the beginning in sequence so that the conclusion arrived in the context of what had preceded it. He read the summary of the investigation's scope. He read the investigator's description of the documentation reviewed. He read the findings. 2 sustained findings, 30-day suspension, permanent protocol change. He sat at the desk for a moment after reading it. He was not surprised exactly because the documentation had said what the documentation said, and the documentation had been clear. But there was a specific quality to receiving the formal confirmation that was different from knowing the documentation was clear. It was the quality of a thing that could have gone a different way depending on variables that were not within his control going the way that the record said it should go. He had the receipt. He had the camera footage. He had the dean of students who stepped out of a budget meeting. He had the documentation that made the outcome possible. Not every situation came with all of those. He folded the letter. He put it in the folder with the receipt and the copy of his formal statement. He called his mother. The university's Student Affairs Division also conducted a parallel review of the campus security contractor's response protocols and produced a supplemental requirement for all campus security personnel before initiating any extended identity verification of a student. Officers were required to first review any documentation the student produced, attempt to verify that documentation through available systems, and contact the relevant establishment manager before escalating. The supplemental requirement was added to the contractor's campus security training program. Darnell Watkins filed his own statement 3 days after the incident after his algorithm's midterm. He had waited until after the midterm deliberately. He had made a decision in the hours after the incident that the midterm was the immediate obligation and that the statement was the obligation that required the specific, careful attention that he was not going to have in the 3 days before the midterm. He was not going to file a statement under time pressure that deserved the time he was going to give it after the midterm. He had taken the midterm. He had gone to the exam room at 9 o'clock on Tuesday morning with the supplemental workbook's practice problems accumulated in his memory, which was the specific translated form that preparation takes when the preparation has been done correctly, not the practice problems themselves, but the pattern they had made in his understanding of the material, so that when the exam presented a graph traversal problem with a dynamic programming component, he did not need to remember the workbook problem he had solved. He had the underlying approach, which the workbook had built, and the approach was available. He had worked through the exam in the specific methodical sequence of a student who has been taught by his own experience to read the full exam before starting to identify the problems he is most confident in and to move to them first so that the problems he is less confident in are attempted with a partial grade already secured. He had done this. He had worked through the exam in 1 hour and 40 minutes of the 2 hours allotted and had reviewed his answers in the remaining 20 minutes and had changed 2 of them and left the rest. He had submitted. He had walked out of the exam room and across the East Quad in the October afternoon light, which was a different quality of light than it had been on the afternoon of the incident, because a different week had passed and the angle of the October sun had changed, and he had thought crossing the quad that the week between the incident and the midterm had been the hardest study week he had had in 14 months. Not because the material was harder, though the algorithms were demanding, but because the 28 minutes in the security office and the 232 minutes of studying that followed in the 3 days before Tuesday had required a specific additional expenditure of attention management that studying in ordinary circumstances did not. He had done it. He had done well on it. He had come home and sat at his desk and written the statement. He had thought about how to write it for 3 days in the intervals between the algorithm's study sessions in the specific running background process that he had learned to let run when a task required thought, and the thought did not require his full foreground attention. By the time he sat down to write it, he had the shape of it, what it needed to say, and in what order and in what register, which was the register of a person who understands that the record of what happened is the resource available to make what happened meaningful beyond the people who experienced it, and who is therefore committed to making the record as clear and as complete and as unambiguous as possible. He wrote it in a register that was precise and unhurried and that did not perform emotion because the facts of the situation were the statement, and the facts did not require supplementing with performed emotion to say what they said. He wrote it the way his mother kept her receipts, not for display, but because the documentation you have is the documentation that works for you. He said that he was a sophomore in the computer science program at Harmon County State University on merit scholarship with a 3.7 GPA. He said that on the afternoon of the incident, he had gone to the bookstore for a specific academic purpose, had made a legitimate purchase with a debit card, had received a receipt, and had been stopped on the way back to the library by an officer who had not reviewed his receipt, had not checked the bookstore's camera footage, and had not contacted the bookstore manager, all of which were actions that would have resolved the situation in the first 2 minutes. He said, "I want to be specific about what the record contains. The record contains a receipt showing a transaction at 1:53 p.m. The record contains camera footage showing me exiting the bookstore at 1:58 p.m. The record contains the bookstore manager's confirmation that my purchase is in the point-of-sale system. The record contains a theft report that contained no description of a suspect. These are facts in the record, and they say what they say." He said, "I am a first-generation college student on academic scholarship. I am here because my parents worked for 14 years and 22 years, respectively, so that I could be here. I am here because I qualified for this scholarship and because I have maintained the GPA required to keep it. I have a midterm in algorithms that I took 3 days after this incident. I spent 28 minutes in a security office on the basis of no articulable suspicion and the fact that I was walking from the direction of a building I had just made a legitimate purchase from." He said, "I am going to be here next semester and the semester after that. I am going to get my degree. I am going to work in this field. I am going to build the things in this field that the field requires, and I am going to build them the same way I built the documentation for this complaint, carefully, specifically in a format that says what it needs to say, and does not require supplementing with anything that the facts do not already contain. I am filing this statement so that the record is complete." He signed it. He submitted it. He called his mother. She answered on the second ring. He said, "I filed it." She said, "Good." He said, "I did well on the midterm." She said, "I know you did." She said it with the specific, quiet certainty of a mother who has known her son for 20 years and who does not make statements about his work that she does not believe. He was quiet for a moment. She said, "You doing okay?" He said, Yeah, I'm okay." She said, "Your father wants to drive up next weekend." He said, "You don't have to do that." She said, "We know we don't have to. He wants to." He said, "Okay." They drove up the following Saturday, which was a 4-hour drive each way. Curtis Watkins stood in the East Quad in October in the same slacks and the same blue-collared shirt he had worn on orientation day, and he looked at the academic buildings and the library and the bookstore and the campus security administration building visible at the far end of the quad. He said, "That the bookstore?" Darnell said, "Yeah." Curtis nodded. He said, "How's the algorithms class?" Darnell said, "Good. I did well on the midterm." Curtis said, "You were going to." He said it in the same specific low register he had used on orientation day. The voice of a man who has spent 22 years getting up at 4:30 and going to work, and who knows from that specific kind of experience that certain things are not surprising when you have done the work. They walked across the East Quad. They went to the dining hall for lunch. They sat at one of the long tables in the dining hall, which was not full on a Saturday afternoon, and ate the specific institutional food of a university dining operation that does its best within the constraints of volume. And Sylvia asked him about the algorithms class, and he explained what algorithms was, which he had done before in various forms, but which his mother always listened to as if it were the first time, because her interest in what he was doing was not the performative interest of a parent who asks questions to demonstrate interest, but the genuine curiosity of a woman who had taken 2 college courses in her 20s and who had a feel for what coursework required and who wanted to understand what her son's coursework actually was. Curtis ate and listened and did not say much. He said at one point about the midterm, what was the hardest problem. Darnell said graph traversal. There was a dynamic programming component I hadn't seen that formulation of before. Curtis said, "Did you get it right?" Darnell said I got most of it. Curtis said most of it. He said it not as a criticism, but as the specific calibrating statement of a man who understands that most of it is what the situation produces when the preparation was good and the problem was hard, and that most of it on a hard problem is a different thing than most of it on an easy one. He said, "You'll get all of it next time." Darnell said, "Yeah." Curtis looked at the east quad through the dining hall window. He said, "You're going to be here." He said it in the same register he had used on orientation day. The same flat and certain voice. Not a question, not a pep talk. A fact that he was stating, because the fact needed to be stated in the specific way that a fact stated by a father carries a different weight than the same fact stated by anyone else. Darnell said, "I'm going to be here." They drove home to Millfield in the afternoon, which was 4 hours of highway and county road, in the specific accumulated quiet of a family that has said what needed to be said and is now simply together in the car. Darnell went back to the library that evening. He had a data structures problem set due on Thursday. He worked until 9:30. He packed his bag and walked back to the residence hall across the east quad, past the benches where students gathered and the dining hall entrance and the computer science building with the algorithms professor's office, which was the walk he had been making for 14 months. Which was the walk his parents had driven 4 hours to drop him, at the beginning of which was the walk that a merit scholarship and a 3.7 GPA and a data structures problem set due on Thursday, and a father who got up at 4:30 and a mother who kept receipts had made possible for him to make, and which he intended to make for the next 2.5 years and beyond. He walked it in the specific, unhurried way of a student who is going back to his room because the work is done for the night, and tomorrow there will be more work, and the work is the point. And he is exactly where he is supposed to be, doing exactly what he came here to do, in a place that his mother's 14 years and his father's 22 years had made possible for him to be. He walked across the quad. He passed the benches where students sat between classes and the entrance to the East Academic Building where the bookstore was. He did not look at the bookstore entrance in any particular way. He did not avoid it. He walked past it in the same unhurried transit he used for everything on the quad, because the East Academic Building was a building on his campus, and the bookstore in it was a bookstore where he had purchased $43 in academic materials across 14 months, and where he was going to purchase more in the months ahead, because the coursework continued. And the coursework required materials, and the receipt was in his email archive with the subject line, "Order Confirmation." Harmon County State University Bookstore, and it said everything it needed to say. He had learned to keep records. He had learned this from his mother, who kept every receipt for every agency-related expense in a folder she had maintained for 14 years, because the agency's reimbursement process required documentation, and because Sylvia Watkins had understood from the beginning that the documentation you have is the documentation that works for you, and the documentation you don't have is the gap that works against you. She had passed the practice to Darnell, not as an instruction, but as a model, the same way she had passed him the community college transcripts, because showing was a more durable form of teaching than telling. He had his receipt. He had kept it in his jacket pocket from the moment M. Torres handed it to him at Register 3 until the moment he placed it on the desk in the security office, and he had kept it after that, after it came back to him with the rest of his things, when he left the office, and he had given it to Dr. Osei's assistant the following morning as part of the complaint documentation, and he had his digital confirmation in his email, which served as a second copy, because keeping 2 copies of important documentation was something his mother had done for 14 years, and something he had absorbed as a practice. He went inside. He sat at his desk. He opened the data structures textbook to the problem set section. He looked at the first problem. He began working. He had a 3.7 GPA. He had a receipt. He had a data structures problem set due on Thursday. He was going to be here in the spring semester and the fall after that and all the semesters until the degree was in his hands, and his parents were in the audience, and his mother was in the specific held posture of a woman who opened a college acceptance letter at a kitchen table in Millfield and said, "He's going," and who has been moving toward this moment since before he knew what a moment was. He was going to be here. He worked on the problem set. He worked on it for 2 hours. He had a question on the third problem that required him to go back to the lecture notes from the previous week, which he found in his organized notebook in the section labeled Week 7, and which answered the question in the specific way that organized notes answer questions immediately and completely, because the note was there because he had taken it when the professor said the thing it contained, and the note was organized because he had organized it, and the organization was available to him now because he had built it before he needed it. He worked through the problem. He got it. He submitted the problem set on Thursday at 11:42 in the morning on time, which was the only way he submitted things. He was going to be here. He was going to be here, and the degree was going to be there, and his parents were going to drive 4 hours for it.